Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and a special video in tribute to the wonderful Nobel Prize winning Canadian writer, short story writer, Alice Munro, who passed away a week ago at the age of 92. And a bunch of us big readers around the world are feeling quite bereft. So I have impaneled, is that a verb? I think I can use that verb. I have impaneled a group of bookish social media luminaries to talk about what Alice Munro's writing meant to us, and then we're going to get into one of her very first published short stories, the title story from her first collection, Dance of the Happy Shades. Let me just quickly introduce the panel. And Laurie is wearing a white shirt and sitting in front of one of her fabulous paintings. Laurie McFadden is a poet and a painter, and the better half, I think, maybe perhaps, of Lindy's Magpie Reads. And they are joining us from Victoria, and Lindy is sitting in the colorful sweater in competition with Laurie's painting, and she is of the BookTube channel Lindy's Magpie Reads and an old friend of mine. And then we have Jolene of the fabulous BookTube channel, Bookworm Adventure Girl, joining us from Calgary, and we needed a token American and a token straight man on the panel. And who better to fulfill that slot for future grant funding than the wonderful, most articulate bookish podcast host in the world, Trevor Barrett of the Mooks and the Gripes podcast, and another real lover of Alice Munro's works, joining us from Utah. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Sean.
Hey, Sean.
All right, so we're going to get started just sharing some general thoughts. I'm finding myself really inarticulate to try to talk about Alice Munro, what she meant to me. So I'm going to get inspiration from all of you. I'm kind of rendered mute by how important her work has been to me as a reader. So, well, maybe I'll start with a quick little anecdote. One time I met her, meeting is not the right word, but the one time I was in line to get books signed, and it was at a Harbourfront event in Toronto many years ago, and it was a double billing Alice Munro and Robertson Davies. And I didn't care and still don't care anything about Robertson Davies or his work, but I certainly got right in line for Alice Munro, and I had all of my books open to the title page. I thought I was being very considerate, and I plunked them all down in front of her, and I said, "Sorry to do this to you." And she kind of made a face, but she was still smiling mostly. But one of the officious book festival officials came over and intercepted me and said, "That's too many. You're going to have to pick out just a few." And so I very sulkily just picked out the hardcovers and got her to sign them. So that was my one time that my path crossed, but my path has crossed much more deeply and meaningfully with her fiction. So now I'd like to turn it over to Laurie. Laurie, tell us about you and Alice.
Okay, well, she goes way back to my early adolescence, really. My mother gave me my first Alice Munro collection, Lives of Girls and Women, when I was, I'm gonna say 14, 15, maybe a little bit younger that book came out, that collection came out. But what I've been reading all week since Alice died was that everybody's been mentioning how in their analysis of her, canon, that the women in her stories are sexual beings. They have sex, and they have different kinds of sex, and they have sex with different types of characters. Guilt-free sex and crazy sex and forbidden sex. Probably she was one of the first women to candidly just insert those things, into her stories, matter-of-factly, like it wasn't a big dramatic thing. It was just, she recognized that sex is a part of our lives, and that women in particular maybe just it's not recognized so much in literature, that, it's either on the porn end of things or on the virginal chaste end of things. And so she just plunked sex right in the middle of, and I don't mean in a tawdry way. It was just a matter of fact. Here's, a middle-aged woman living in, southwestern Ontario, and she has a sex life. The story in particular from Lives of Girls and Women, and I'm not sure if it's the title chapter or what, but it was made into a short, maybe an hour-long TV movie on the CBC back in the day, because CBC did that sort of thing with Canadian writers back in the day. The story is about Del Jordan, who figures through most, it's trial tracks her through the entire collection. She's a really smart young woman. She's maybe 15 or 16, something like that. And she's getting ready to finish high school and take the big, I don't know, scholarship exam that will project her into university scholarship. They've been planning this for her whole life because she's so smart and she's, always aces all the exams in high school and whatever. However, in the spring leading up to the big final exam, she meets a boy who's from a local Pentecostal church, has a big baptism event in their town. She somehow makes his acquaintance, and he's a year or two older than her. And to cut to the chase, they end up hanging out and being, sexually attracted to each other as, they're about that age, budding sexuality and whatever. So they end up having sex standing up on the side of her house one evening, like late in the night, near midnight. And this is Dell losing her virginity, as young girls do in Alice Munro's world and the real world. She's, at the same time, so celebratory about it, Dell herself, but also, feeling a bit guilty and strange. She knows her mother is not going to be thrilled by the fact that she's been deflowered, allowed this not just a boy, but a boy that's connected to a very, Pentecostal type church with the snakes and the speaking in tongues and the immersion baptism in the river and stuff like that. It's the next morning after Dell has been deflowered. She's, clearly excited that this has happened, and she wants to tell her mother without telling her mother. How do you tell your mother you've lost your virginity without telling your mother that you've lost your virginity? So she says, oh, I was outside and there's a patch of blood on the ground by the side of the house, referring to her, being deflowered. Maybe a cat got a sparrow there or something. Like, she just teases this fact to her mom. She doesn't come out and say, hey, I lost my virginity on the side of the house, but just is very mysterious about it. I could just picture, the mindset of the teenage girl for whom this is so important, right? I really need to burst out with this information, but I can't just tell my mother. This has stuck in my mind decades later from Alice Munro. The way she matter-of-factly just allows women to make the decision to have sex, and, all the various collections and the various stories and the various women, the young women, old women, married women. It was refreshing to have someone so smartly and articulately document the family lives, married lives, dating lives, relationship lives that, women have. And the follow-up to what happens with Dell is that once Dell takes the big exam for the scholarship, she's so still, gaga over this boy that she just has lost interest and doesn't study, doesn't prepare properly, and she doesn't get the scholarship, and her mother is livid, and she just cannot believe that Dell has thrown away her future for a boy. Again, that just rings so true. Dell is like still in that woo-woo land of, oh, I don't care, I'm in love, I had sex, but her mother is just not just a boy, but a boy that's connected to this Pentecostal rock and roll speaking in tongues religion. The mother's all science and education and not, no spirituality element whatsoever. So that was my big introduction to Alice Munro, and that the fact that story has stuck with me decades later is, I think, tantamount to the kind of writing, the quality of her writing, and the lasting impact of her writing. And I think
Wonderful.
I should stop there because I probably took way more than my time.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yes.
Started with one of her early ones.
Yeah.
Let's go to Lindy. Lindy, tell us what Alice Munro meant to you.
Well, I think Laurie captured a lot of why I love Alice Munro's writing so much. And that is that it's not only her characters, but the situations that they're in really stick with me. And, I can look back on stories from Runaway, for example, and scenes just come back to me. She can put so much in one short story that's, you could call it a novel. Her stories do tend to be on the longer side, and so rich and layered, yet with a lot of concision. She doesn't have extra stuff in there. It's everything is important. The thing that I thought of when Laurie was talking about sex and deflowering was the time I was working at the Edmonton Public Library, and a woman came in with a Alice Munro short story collection
Oh, yes.
to return. She didn't want to put it through the return slot. She wanted to tell me personally. She flipped open to the back. She said, look at her author photo. Doesn't she look sweet and innocent? But she has a filthy mind. So, yeah, not for everyone, I guess. But I really didn't expect that to be the next sentence that this woman would have about Alice Munro.
That's a great story. Jolene, tell us tell us about you and Alice.
Well, much like Laurie, I was probably about 14 or 15 when I first read Alice Munro as well. And it was Lives of Girls and Women. And I think I happened to pick it up very like, oh, that's a nice cover. That's a nice title. I've heard of Alice Munro. Maybe I'll try this. So I don't think I really knew a whole lot about anything to do with Alice Munro. And of course, we all know now that she's like a Canadian, icon. So I was very taken by that book. And I loved, not only as both Laurie and Lindy have talked about, like the writing and just how real it is and the characters are real, but also in how she writes her short stories, and it could all be a novel. Like it could have been a novel. So I love how she brings her short stories together in that particular collection anyway. And I've always thought I really need to read more Alice Munro. So I have 10 of Alice Munro's books on my shelf, and not the one that we read from, of course, like Murphy's Law. But I have thought about doing something similar to what I did before when I did Mondays with Margaret, and I read, all of Margaret Atwood's books. I thought about doing something like that with Alice Munro and really looking into her short stories and, seeing how they progress over time in publication order and all of those things like I've done in the past. Because, yeah, I do think that there's something there. And I think to do a reread of The Lives of Girls and Women would be very interesting now that I'm not 15. See if it captures me in the same way or if I get something new from it. Yeah.
Well, sign me up for that project. That's a wonderful idea. Yes.
Thank you.
And it would be really interesting, Jolene, to hear your thoughts on Lives of Girls and Women now that you're 21.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Now that I'm right, 21.
I know for a fact that Trevor is not only a huge fan of Alice Munro's, but you have done various reading projects and blogging about her. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Oh boy, Alice Munro, I often will say that she's one of those authors that I wouldn't be who I am today if not for her. And I don't just mean in my reading life. I mean the kind of person I am. I think for the better, she has improved how I interact with other people. And I owe a lot to her writing. I came to her maybe 15, 20 years ago. And so it was a little bit later on in her career, and it was with the stories she was publishing in the New Yorker for some of her later collections. And I loved them. I really did love them. I thought they were really wonderfully well written, intriguing. But I came to know her work when I finally decided I'm going to start at the beginning and read from Dance with the Happy Shades all the way up to wherever she ends up. At the time, I was hoping there might be another collection, but that was about the time that Dear Life came out. In fact, that may have been the collection that I first started to do story by story. And so I went back and started reading Dance with the Happy Shades, really enjoyed that first collection. But it's so fascinating to me how many of us have already talked about how meaningful Lives of Girls and Women was to both our relationship with Munro and maybe just reading in general. I wish I had read it earlier in my life because that book really did change how I was reading her work. It opened up even the stuff I'd already read, but that's where I really started to understand that here is someone who is willing to explore so much about herself and about culture and society and about being a woman or a young girl. things I had not, no direct personal experience with, but I have plenty of women and girls in my life. And it was so refreshing to have somebody and talking about things that even some of the women in my life probably felt like they couldn't talk about or shouldn't think about or anything like that. And I just found it beautiful. And there's a quote in the epilogue to Lives of Girls and Women that I also think really changed how I look at just people in general, my neighbors, that I think I know, but I don't. And it says, people's lives in Jubilee, as elsewhere, were dull, simple, amazing, and unfathomable. Deep caves paved with kitchen linoleum.
Yeah.
It's such a great line and such a tremendous insight to all of us have these deep caves that aren't really reflected necessarily by our domestic outward appearance. And she just does such a great job of digging into that. So it's been a great journey. Again, each collection has really kind of influenced me in different ways. And I love how she, again, seems to be very willing to explore probably some of her deepest, I want to say the word demons, but that probably is a little bit reductive, but some of her probably deeper concerns about herself and about her life and about her relationships within her stories. I think she is brave. And again, I so excited to get together and just talk about her for a little bit.
I love that. Was an epigraph? So was that an Alice Munro sentence, or was it from somewhere else, Trevor?
It's an epilogue. It's the
It's
epilogue
an
called The
epilogue.
Photographer. It's not just an afterthought by Munro herself. It's in text as part of this book about
Oh,
Adele,
okay.
the young woman that we learned about a little bit earlier.
Resonate so much with what she would always say. I've been watching, I'm probably not the only one on this panel that's been watching some of her interviews or listening to them in the last week. And she always took issue when interviewers would ask her about these ordinary people that she would write about. And she said she really, really deeply objected to that adjective. She said, I don't think they're ordinary. They're extraordinary to me. There's no such thing as an ordinary person. And that was really at the heart of her fiction. From the Canadians and the American on the panel, how Canadian was her fiction? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I got to dig deep into it with the help of other Canadian readers. Kevin from Canada, one of my friends who's from Calgary, in my, maybe 15 years ago, was the one who said, you need to get to know Alice Munro better. I'm sending you some of her books. And he would talk about how important she was in general. So I probably can't speak necessarily to all the ways she is Canadian, but I felt like I learned a lot reading her. I loved her stories set further north than I grew up in Idaho, so more north than me. Again, I loved that she was the brave one going there.
Yeah, I'm asking a question that I couldn't possibly answer, but is there something about her work that is distinctly Canadian? Any thoughts on that?
I want to say that, because Canada is such a vast, wide country, I don't think there's a specific Canadianism as opposed to like in the way that Margaret Lawrence placed her Manawaka series in Manitoba. And that, I think, definitely rings true, that geography, that the, colloquialisms, whatever. I think the same way with Alice Munro setting, not all, but much of her, communities were in that southwestern part of Ontario, Port Hope and the Wingham area. You could say they're so totally classically Canadian, and yet I would think that they just happen to be, they're totally classically, universally human. This happened to be set in this part of the Canadian geography and written by a Canadian author, but she wrote about humanity, more specifically, women, but men certainly figured in her stories as well. I don't think you could put nationality or regionality onto that, the writer's, overall narrative. I think, I grew up in Ontario and recognized that, it's the geography, the trees, the botany, whatever, some of the references for sure, but I don't think Alice herself would have assumed that everyone would think that, her placing these characters and communities, writing about the geography she knew and the small town people that she knew. I don't think she was attempting to say this is Canada right here, because Canada is so much more than that. Like each province has its regional differences, as we know.
You raise an important point. I think there's a paradox. This is not my original thought, but there's a paradox that the more deeply you imbue a sense of place in your fiction, the more it can transcend its particularity. And I think that is really one way of looking at the magic of the narratives that she spun.
Like you wouldn't say that Lucy Maud Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables, is set in a very specific region of Canada, in Prince Edward Island, and it's total Canadiana, and yet it's not, that's not all there is to Canada. And in the same way, like in Margaret Lawrence's writings, and people that have written BC and Saskatchewan and Alberta, and just they all are very much screaming Canada, but they're also reflecting very minute, specific, concentrated regions of Canada that each have their own, personality and just.
Yeah, and another thing is Alice Munro is writing about white people.
True.
Absolutely.
In Edmonton, there's it used to be called the Canadian Literature Centre, and they have changed their name. Now they're the Centre for Literatures in Canada, recognizing that there's not just one Canadian literature. And I think that applies to this discussion here. Yeah.
Lindy, do you have any references from Alice Munro of Tim Hortons? Any Tim Hortons references and favorite Munro reading?
I don't think so. I should go back and look, but no.
I'm not sure I'm going to allow a conversation about one of Canada's most embarrassing institutions on my channel. It's one of the perpetual feuds Lindy and I've had. She thinks it has some cultural importance. All I think of them is their coffee is undrinkable.
But it is remarkable how many Canadian books reference Tim Hortons, because I've got over 70, I think I might be over 80 now, separate references to Tim Hortons from different novels and nonfiction, and including American and Australian authors in there. Yeah.
Let's move into talking about the story, and then maybe we'll circle back to some more general thoughts at the end. All of us have either read, reread, or listened to the short story Dance with the Happy Shades. Margaret Atwood, I don't know if she recorded this audio recently or not, but it was in The Guardian recently, and so that's what I did. I listened to it while reading the ebook alongside of it. And so we're not going to worry about spoilers for this short story. In fact, I'm going to give you a little synopsis, which basically tells you what happens in the story, and then we're going to move into the discussion. So it opens with an elderly spinster. Her name is Miss Marcells, and she's been a music teacher. She's in Rosedale, so it's set in Toronto, I'm pretty sure. And she has been a music teacher for several generations of women in the neighborhood or whatever. And now she's quite elderly, and she puts on recitals where her students perform, and people go out of obligation because she's a little bit kind of, you just have to feel a sense of obligation. She taught you, and then she taught your children, and you feel like you ought to go, but it's not very enjoyable. And she gives out books and gifts to the kids that they don't want to read, and with each year it's getting more and more a sense of obligation that's not at all fun. And she has gone down in life in terms of her economic station, so she keeps moving into poorer areas. The point of view is maybe a teenage girl and her mother, and Miss Marcells taught her mother, and now it's the girl, the daughter, who's the consciousness for the story, who is performing, and she feels like she's too old to be doing this. Nobody wants to be there, but they go to the newest home of Miss Marcells and her elderly bedridden sister, and not very many people show up. And Miss Marcells has put all the food for the party out on the table since 5 a.m. in the morning, and there's flies buzzing around the sandwiches, and the sandwiches are curling up on the table, and you're all focused on all those details. And everything is kind of negative about poor Miss Marcells in this piano recital from hell. And then some new students come in, And they are from a school or an institution for, we would say today, cognitively challenged students, one of whom at least has what we would call Down syndrome today. And she plays a piece of music that just bowls everyone over and changes the story and changes the reader and changes the characters completely. So there is the synopsis. And now we will get your reaction.
If you don't mind, I'll just lodge something in here really quickly. One of the delights of doing this Alice Munro project is that a woman named Betsy Peltz, who doesn't live nearby to me. I think maybe when we started, I was living in New Jersey and she's in the Northeast, the US. She decided to do it with me. And her thoughts on this story are quite unique. Again, just ways for me to learn because she has a grandson who at the time that we wrote about this over a decade ago was 4 years old and with Down syndrome. And so her insights onto this story are again powerful and personal to her. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there that my own response to this story the first time I read it was much more looking at all of the other people and how they were responding to the events. But she focuses on the children who come with Down syndrome and to Alice Munro's portrayal, how important that would have been, for a story published in, I think, 1961. And so this has become a very special story for me, both for its contents, but also for the idea of other people's readings of it or of other stories in general and how personal they can be and therefore how meaningful they can be to me. I know I didn't say anything about the story yet.
That's okay.
But I'm
glad
looking forward to everyone's responses because of that. We're all taking away the various things that we can get from it our first time, but in a discussion like this, that can be so much richer.
Yes, that's great. I read that just yesterday, Trevor, and I'm going to link to your friend's thoughts on it and your blogging entries about it in the show notes because it's fabulous. So some first thoughts on Dance of the Happy Shades. Trevor noted it was published in 1961, I think in some kind of a literary journal or something, and then the collection was published in 1968.
I wanted to step off from what Trevor said and talk about, although nowhere in the story is the term Down syndrome mentioned, because back in the day, that was not a term that was used. And in the story itself, they're nice little things and some of them quite musical, but of course they're not all there, euphemism. And on the next page, there's someone's thinking, I'm not repelled, but nobody told me I was going to come here to listen to a procession of little idiots, for that's what they are. I mean, it makes me think that if this story were written today, it could never get published because it would just be considered so offensive, this language and this. I don't want to complain about, the concept of political correctness. It just, back in that era, it was called mongoloid. And I have a cousin who recently died last year with Down syndrome, who lived into her 50s, where, that's like 10 years beyond what the typical lifespan was back in, say, the 60s or 70s. It was considered, they're lucky if they make it to 40. And all these things were going through my mind when I was listening to this story being read by Margaret Atwood. Just so much has changed from the 60s to now. I mean, in terms of like where I grew up in Ontario that she writes in, the place, there wasn't distinction between mental retardation versus Down syndrome versus autism versus epilepsy. Everyone just was lumped into this and sent to Ontario Hospital. That was the broad, vague name of, if you weren't quite right in the head, you just all the little idiots, pardon my language, although that's the language Alice uses in the story, got sent to Ontario Hospital and were just all lumped in together as, undesirables, basically, and kids with no future. And that's so sad now to think of that, but it was in my lifetime, it was in Lindy's lifetime, all our lifetimes and the progress that has been made is astonishing. But like I say, I think I can see people reading this now and who aren't familiar with Alice Major and might read this because, I want to read her first.
Alice Munro.
Sorry, I had a Zoom with Alice Major, the poet from Edmonton yesterday, and Alice M and Alice M on the calendar 2 days in a row. Sorry, Alice Munro. I can see people now saying, oh, this is horrible. Like, she said these things about, about these poor children with Down syndrome. Like, I wasn't suggesting Alice was calling them this. Like, that she uses, the characters to, it's her characters that say or think these things, and she does that quite deftly. Show the small town attitude.
What Munro has done is use the voice of a girl as the narrator, and she's recounting what her mother and this other woman at the party are saying. As we see by the end of the story, the children and Miss Marcel's have a whole special place that it's like the opposite of being disparaged.
Well, when I first started the short story, I was thinking that it almost reminded me of like Virginia Woolf or even a Jane Austen, but I think more Virginia Woolf, and like it's just a regular day. People are getting ready for some kind of party. It kind of reminded me of Mrs. Dalloway a little bit. And it was just like a regular, normal, we're going to get everything ready. And then there's the whole judgment of this woman, and you're kind of getting a kind of an overview of how she is portrayed in the community. And I loved that Alice Munro used the narrator as a young person to kind of see the perspective through what they would be experiencing by listening to all of the adults in the story and listening to how people are being perceived and whether they understand it or not. Like, so whether it's a yes, I agree, or I don't. And yet there was kind of this openness to, this is what everybody's saying, but we're supposed to go to this party and this is what's important and all of those things. So I just thought that was brilliant. And then I also think it's brilliant of Alice Munro, the way she has kind of made this story where when the children come in, that she treats them the exact same way she treated the others. There was no difference. There was, she celebrates them in the same way. She celebrates their music in the same way. And I loved that because, yes, for the time that this was written, that would have been very powerful, I think. We're now, it's almost like obviously, obviously she treats them the same, in my understanding of the world. But in 1961, I'm not so sure that would have been, we should be hiding these people. They should belong in institutions. We didn't necessarily give people value in the same way that we hopefully do now. And we wouldn't have recognized their talents or even have thought to maybe teach them the music in the first place. So I loved how she did that. I thought it was a brilliant story.
Oh my God, yes. And I just want to get a couple sentences in here from the story, because I think they're key, because they sucked me in, where I thought this was just going to be kind of a story about a piano recital from hell, and and I was sucked into this perspective on Miss Marcel's, and so this is one passage. The deceits which her spinster sentimentality has practiced on her original good judgment are legendary and colossal. She has this way of speaking of children's hearts as if they were something holy. It is hard for a parent to know what to say. It will be understood, which is a very interesting phrase to use. It will be understood that Miss Marcel's idealistic view of children, her tender or simple-mindedness in that regard, made her almost useless as a teacher. She was unable to criticize except in the most delicate and apologetic way, and her praises were unforgivably dishonest. It took an unusually conscientious pupil to come through with anything like a creditable performance. Yeah, those ones really jumped out at me, especially upon, when we get to the end and find out how the story, where the story goes.
I wonder if this story is one of the things that primed me for Lives of Girls and Women. As I was talking earlier about how this did change who I am and how I see other people, this story is set up in a way that I like how you put it, Sean. We're kind of drawn into, oh yeah, we've been to these parties before. It's uncomfortably familiar and close to home, the judgmental, superiority of the adults in this party. it's uncomfortable, the idea that, oh, she should just stop doing this. We know better for her. We pity her, so some of us attend. Would I were courageous enough to be one of my friends who decided I'm not coming this year. How much that hits close to home, and how a story like this makes me go, how often have I been so blind? How often have I been that person who comes in with my own, I know what's up. And I do think that this may have been one of the stories in that collection that started to kind of revolutionize the way I was reading her stories in general, recognizing maybe a little bit better what she's doing sometimes with the structure. And I think she's working through these things too. I'm not trying to say, I love that Alice Munro, I think, is working through her own perspectives and her own life. And so she's honest enough to go there and to use harsh language and to talk about things that in ways that we wouldn't accept today. I love how you put that, Laurie. But a lot of times in reading her stories, I've been the one on the receiving end of having to come to look in the mirror and go, wow, what do I know? How ignorant am I? How often have I been just blind to what people are going through and missing the humanity, the beauty, the pain? And again, a story like this that really does, for the first however much of it, almost seem trite, because all we're doing is griping about this party in ways that, again, I'm finding quite familiar. And then it becomes something transcendent. Again, probably for me, maybe not the most life-changing story in general, but maybe the thing that primed the pump for me to get there.
I really like that word transcendent that you use, Trevor. Yeah. I think it's very apt in this story.
Mm-hmm.
And it resonates with just the lovely last line, which is about what was the name of the song, and it's the Dance of the Happy Shades. And they would always say about her, especially after they were finally leaving this drudgery, there's this drudge of a party, if that's a word, oh, poor Miss Marcel's. But they don't say that. It is the dance of the happy shades that prevents us. It is that one communique from the other country where she lives, which is what when you say the word transcendent, there's something in that for me.
What an appropriate choice of music too. That I did listen to it. It's by Gluck.
Yeah, I looked it up.
But that would have that title.
Hmm.
Yeah, Dance of the Happy Shades. And these people who are in shadow to the judgmental central characters in the story. And actually they're dancing. They're perfectly content with how they are.
And so is Miss Marcel's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I definitely include her in that.
Yeah. Two other very short quotes near the end. People who believe in miracles do not make much fuss when they actually encounter one. And to her, Miss Marcel's, no gift is unexpected. No celebration will come as a surprise. Just some real powerful sentences to reflect on.
And I like that this is a young narrator, a young woman, who I think is recognizing that here's where I've been with my mom, and here's this different area where Miss Marcel and these students are. And I think she recognizes she's the lesser for it, that she's not in that same space, or at least open, there's not openness between those two spaces that there should be. I like that there's that potential of this epiphany that she has here toward the end, that and again, being able to open that door and stop being over here, but go over. I like that she recognizes she may be the one lacking.
Maybe as we move to closing out this discussion, you can tailor your comments directly to this story if you want, or speak more generally about Alice Munro as a short story writer, because that she very much was. Lives of Girls and Women can be read kind of as a short story cycle, but she was very determined to write short stories and really nothing but. And There aren't very many writers like that in the world, that especially to reach such fame. So, any comments about the form in which she chose to write compared to most people wrote novels or novels and short stories? Any thoughts on genre and Alice Munro?
I think short stories are really underrated. And I think Canada does short stories very well. Like Canadian writers do short stories really well. It's kind of one of the, I guess, forms of literature that we're known for in some ways. You know, you have to, when you're in school in Canada, you have to learn all these short stories, and like, so there's just something about short stories, I think, for Canadians, that I don't know what it is that we kind of like it, but I think that there's something to short stories that that a novel can't give us, and not in the same way. So, for example, even with this particular short story, it starts off as something, it becomes something else. It has a powerful message if you're paying attention. And a novel can do that, but to do that kind of in a shorter length is very tricky. Like, that's a challenge to really make you feel about a character, make you, kind of envision the characters, envision the setting, envision all of those things, and then to make you feel a number of things within only, 15, 30 pages, whatever it happens to be. And I think writers who can do that have a real talent for telling a good story. And I love short stories for learning how a writer writes and learning what is important to them. I think sometimes their short stories are more telling of who they are as writers than their novels. Because I haven't read all of Alice Munro, I do love connected short stories and how she did that, particularly in Lives of Girls and Women. So she obviously loved it, and I love that she stayed true to what kind of genre she was kind of going for, or what format she was going for, at least.
It is a tribute to Canada's literary culture that short story collections often feature on your prize lists. They're not excluded as they are in other, it's the Booker Prize is great. They bill themselves as the best of fiction, but they don't allow for short story collections. But the Giller Prize does. She won the governor. I think this collection won the Governor General's Award.
So,
and that, like I say, is, I think, a tribute to your literary culture, that it's recognized this isn't apprentice work. This is the real stuff. It's not just exercises to write my novel someday, but these are, read some Alice Munro, and that myth has to go away, I think.
Yeah, good point, Trevor, about literary prizes in Canada, because of the top prizes, every 3 or 4 years, it's a short story collection that wins. So it just shows that we do appreciate that format.
absolutely. And Trevor, you just used the word apprentice, and I'm going to take that and run with it, because I was expecting that this story wouldn't be all that great. It was from her first published collection. It couldn't be that great. I think it's one of my favorites by her. It's a very traditional structure, but I don't care about that. It's so impactful. So that this is how she started. That's amazing. I couldn't believe how much I love this story, how well written it was. Beautiful writing, and such a bang at the end. Yeah.
I have an example about people around the world loving Alice Munro. So this was in a novel that I read by Rabi Alameddine called An Unnecessary Woman. It was published back in 2014. Yeah. And if you're not familiar with the story, it's a 72-year-old woman in Beirut who likes to translate her favorite literature into Arabic. And this is a quote: "I'll translate Muriel Sparks, the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, or better yet, the creme de la creme of short story writers, Alice Munro. I can live in Alice's skin for a while."
That's lovely.
Yes. So come from Lebanon.
And I'm going to take that and run with it too, because that's what we've all lived in Alice's skin for more than a few short stories. There's many more for me to discover. And boy, I think that the grief will set in when I finish my last Alice Munro book. I've got a few left, so.
But then you can start over again.
Yes.
Then I can start over again.
I was just gonna say, Sean, I had the same thought, but in reading this, going back to her first one, which I haven't read in I think it whatever we posted that. It's been over 10 years,
Yeah.
and the thought crossed my mind of I can do all this again, and it'll be wonderful. So
I just wanted to mention that the subject matter in this particular story, and on another level, it just took me right back to my own childhood. Like I took piano lessons and starting at age 6, and because I wanted to. And by the time I finished when I was in high school, I didn't want to so much, but something that went along with that was that every year in June, I think they were universally dreaded by the kids that had to sit there in front of everybody's parents and play one song, right, from the youngest, who would be sort of like banging out almost chopsticks, like 30 seconds, to the ones that were like in conservatory level experts. And one other spoke of this, hearing this story was just dropping me right back into that, oh my God, no, please don't make me go. Please don't make me go and be part of this recital. It was just so awful, so awful. So there was that.
Me too, absolutely. So if you have been living under a rock, but you are watching this video from under that rock, I hope that we have tantalized you to pick up any Alice Munro collection and live inside her skin for a while. And I'd like to thank the wonderful panel of bookish social media luminaries, Lori, Lindy, Jolene, and Trevor, for bringing so much light and wisdom to this discussion. Thanks, everybody.
oh, thanks everybody.
Thanks. Well, thank you.
Everybody.